sets of scales that we haven't gone through. Do you guys want to sort of, for us to try to go through them fairly quickly? Is that okay? These, in terms of the comps, are probably not going to be that stressed. I think the core of it is what we've already talked about.
Yeah, I agree.
But it is important that you know they're out there, that you know what they are. So I won't go necessarily through each of them, but I'll get a sense of them and why they were made and how they come into play. So up to now, we've talked about essentially the validity and clinical scales. Those are the core, essentially, you would say, of the MMPI-2. It also has the content scales, which were actually designed because, as we mentioned, psychasthenia, that's not really a diagnostic category. Now we refer to it as anxiety. But anxiety is very complicated. Is it more phobic? Is it more obsessive? And so the content scales were made in order to reflect changes in diagnostic criteria. They're not empirically based. What they did is they're let's look at all the items that overtly reflect anxiety, for instance. So instead of it being empirically keyed, this one is actually based on the content. So it's more conscientious. It's completely different, and they have to be looked at. Studies show that they're good. They're actually normed first with college students and then with a psychiatric population instead of trying to compare the way they did before. And oftentimes they can support and can be used in addition to the clinical skills. So here, and there are also the content component scales, which I won't go into, but know that they're described. Essentially, the first one is anxiety, which is and what it makes sense what it is. It's based on the diagnostic criterion of anxiety. So there's anxiety. There's one based more of phobic anxiety, which is fears. This one is just a general thing because there are no content component. Fears, it can be either generalized fearfulness or multiple fears, depending on what it is. There's one for obsessions, also no content component for them. The depression scale, lack of drive, dysphoria, self-deprecation, and suicidal ideation. Sorry if I'm sort of going really quickly, but I want to at least present it. Again, you have access to this PowerPoint, so you can look at it more clearly. Is that okay with everyone? Next one is health. They're related to sort of somatic complaints. It's actually divided into three. There's gastrointestinal symptoms, which are very common. Neurological symptoms, such as dizziness, certain types of paralysis, twitching, and then generalized health concerns. So you'll be thinking more about feeling being sick, as opposed to oh, I'm getting dizzy. Bizarrementation is related to more psychotic symptoms and symptomatology. There's BIS1, which is actually psychotic symptomatology. They endorse delusions, hallucinations. Then there's more the schizotypal, which is just sort of odd thinking more than actual psychotic experiences. There's anger, which is divided into explosive behavior and irritability. Cynicism, which is a good way when you're looking at somebody with a high scale 4, you might want to look at cynicism to try to understand because cynicism is a high component of scale 4. So looking at that might actually be useful. It's divided into misanthropic beliefs and interpersonal suspiciousness. Again, both would load highly on the scale 4. And then it splits sort of the antisocial characteristics. It's the cynicism, but also antisocial practices. So this is actually more clearly just expressed behaviors, breaking the law, stealing things. Another one is type A, divided into competitive drive, this hyper-competitiveness, wanting to be better than other people, and impatience. So these go beyond just the same as the content scales. They're not trying to reframe them, they're trying to make a completely different typology. Low self-esteem, submissiveness and self-doubt. Social discomfort, that would be load a lot into scale 8. This would lower into scale 8 and 2. Introversion, submissiveness. And there's family problems. You would see a lot of that in scale 4 as well. Family discord and alienation from family. Work interference is usually high for people that have problems in their jobs or at work. And then TRT is actually interesting because we've been talking about things that are sort of poor prognostic for treatment. This is a content scale that actually just measures that, just treatment prognosis, like how this low motivation or inability to disclose. Those are the two things that can lead to a poor prognosis. So higher TRT scale scores are indicative of poor prognosis in therapy in general. Okay. Any questions about the content scales? Okay. There is, as I think Zoe mentioned and I mentioned earlier, there are also supplementary scales that were made by different people that wanted to develop a scale. You don't have to know too much about most of these. Know that they're self-explanatory. Welsh did an anxiety and repression scale. They look for very specific things. It's not like we're trying to create a set of scales that will encompass everyone. These are more like, well, I want to identify people that have these traits. There's ego strength. This one is actually very important if you have to prioritize which ones of these you learn. The McAndrew Alcoholism Revised Scale, which measures not really whether or not people are alcoholics, but rather a tendency to be so. So people that, if they were to drink, would probably overuse or misuse substances. They tend to be sort of impulsive, sensation-seeking, things that would lead to, say, an addictive type of personality. These are a couple of other ones that I would love to be able to go into more detail. When you look at the McAndrew scales, it's important to compare it to APS and AAS. Alcohol Acknowledgement Scale is one where it's not about the potential based on behaviors, but rather how much are they acknowledging it? Very overtly, yes, I drink a lot. I drink more than I should. So if people have a high MAC-R but a low Alcohol Acknowledgement Scale, maybe there's something else going on. And oftentimes they might have a high alcohol acknowledgement, but then it's not a personality thing. It's not they're impulsive and sensation seeking. It's that they just drink. Alcohol potential is more similar to the MAC-R, and there's over-controlled hostility. People that tend to be passive aggressive. They tend to restrain themselves a lot and then sort of explode in anger. Dominant social responsibility, that's another one we tend to score high on. It's probably a good thing. It was developed based on activists at college campuses. College maladjustment, only for people that are in college. PK, I mentioned briefly before, it's post-traumatic stress. It's only applicable if people endorse a trauma. There's hostility, marital distress, and then there's gender role, masculine and feminine, that are similar to scale 5, but actually split it into it's not a one construct that's either male in one end and female in another, but rather two different scales, which is a lot more what gender research supports. Lastly, the last set of scales are the RC scales. RC stands for Restructured Clinical. And as we've been sort of emphasizing now, there's a lot of intercorrelation between scales, where we saw scale 8 has some sort of alienation, but so does scale 2. People tend to score high on both, and it's hard to distinguish. So what they did when they did the RC scales is, okay, let's try to make the scales as simple and unitary as possible. What they realized is that people that tended to score high on all scales were because they were feeling demoralized or general malaise or discomfort. So in Rorschach language, high D. So people that just are generally feel maladjusted. And that loaded onto all of them. So they said, well, why not create a specific scale to measure demoralization, which is sort of general emotional discomfort, and then sort of factor that out, parse that out. So that's the most important thing about the RC scales. They take away the general demoralization, which is really important, and then they look at the constructs more cleanly than the clinical scales. They're very based on the clinical scales, not all that much different. Similarly, high scores are 65 or above, low scores are 40 or below, and you can interpret both.
That's what you saying, they look more clearly or cleanly at it?
Right, like instead of it being, instead of every scale having a little bit of this anxiety or general maladjustment, they parse it out. So it's only looking at the traits that measure whatever they're trying to measure.
It's a more pure analysis.
Right, so it's a more pure analysis of the constructs that they're measuring.
So it's looking at them overall. At them overall. You said, I wasn't sure what you were referring to when you said cleanly. So
right. So when I said cleanly, I mean like they're not muddled with other constructs. Mm-hmm. They're more pure constructs.
Covariance.
Covariance, yes. And if you notice, there's RC1, somatic complaints. That's sort of like scale 1, which is hypochondriasis, which measures somatic complaints. So you don't have to remember these as separate constructs. Just think about them as analogous to the clinical scales, but sort of a little bit more sort of purified or refined. They measure purer constructs. So you have RC1, somatic complaints. RC2, low positive emotions. Kind of like D, like a little like depression, low positive emotionality. RC3 is cynicism. That's sort of the more refined, what they extracted from the hysteria. RC4, antisocial behavior. They're actually like made it so that it's not all these like family distress or like they're just like, okay, we're going to just difficulty confirming societal norms. RC6, instead of paranoia, it's ideas of persecution. So it's make sure it's just like this sort of more psychotic-y thought disordered. If they're higher than 75, they're probably actually endorse hallucinations and delusions as opposed to just some like ideas of reference, not all that clinical.
And there's no RC5 because 5 isn't a clinical scale. Okay.
RC7, sort of the anxiety, but like psychasthenia is more than just anxiety. It's like icky anxiety. It's like very negative, like tumultuous emotions too. So it's, hey, dysfunctional negative emotions. So in a way, if you look at the RC scales, it helps understand the clinical scales. Because it's like, well, what are the clinical scales trying to get at? The RC scales are better at doing that. But it simplifies things a little bit too much. So oftentimes people still prefer to use the clinical scales. RC8, aberrant experiences. Again, the cognitive and motor disturbances. And RC9 is hypomanic activation. So we can see not all that different, a little bit more simplified. And usually you want to use these sort of in conjunction with the clinical scales when both of them are elevated. If one of them is and the other one isn't, then you have to look at why that is, and it provides a much richer interpretation. Psy-5 scales, I don't really look at these that much. I don't talk about them as much. I think they're pretty neat. Essentially, the people that made the MMPI, or like actually probably the company that publishes it, says, oh no, the Milan inventories are taking over because they measure personality. So they put out these to say, hey, we can measure personality too. They use a dimensional approach to personality. They use like the ocean model. Again, 65 and over is always interpretable. Under 40 is only for these two, disconstraint and introversion. And it measures aggressiveness, psychoticism, disconstraint, negative emotions, and introversion, low positive emotions. Essentially, they measure, it's less clinically based, and it's more like based on the notion that personality disorders are just extremes of normal personality. Again, probably not super important to stress these. but you do have to know that they are and sort of understand the theoretical underpinnings of this. A couple more slides. We talked about the MMPI-2 for like 3 hours. We could probably talk more. There's also the MMPI-A. There are a couple of differences that are important to know. It's based on a revision of the MMPI. Notice the lack of 2. It's based on the revision of the MMPI, the original one. It's much shorter, so adolescents are probably able to take it in like probably about 45 minutes instead of like an hour to an hour and a half. It is normed for people, 14 to 18? MMPI-2 is 18 and above. Something important is it does not use K correction. Why? Because defensiveness in adolescents you can correct for defensiveness essentially. So they're all non-K corrected. Instead of having F and F back, they actually have F1 and F2. F1 being sort of in frequency for the first part, F2 in frequency for the latter part. Remember that in the MMPI-2, questions that were considered infrequent were ones that were endorsed by less than 20%. Because adolescents are sort of a species in and of themselves, it actually are questions reported by less than 10, because otherwise it's sort of like all of them there was too much of that. They wanted to control for that. Is there anything else, Zoe, that you think is important to mention about the adolescent version?
I think that only that when they were looking at making the conversion for the MMPI-A from the MMPI, they looked at the fact, like you said, that adolescents tended to have elevations on scale 4, scale 6, scale 7, and scale 8. And so that was really accounted for and factored in to the development of the MMPI-A, like you said, taking into account developmental experiences and really looking at like what was loading onto those elevations. And so that the idea is that when you have an elevation in the MMPI-A, it's going to be a lot more clinically significant because that normal developmental trajectory has already theoretically been accounted for and controlled. Okay?
I think there are a couple of very minor differences in sort of the scales and how it's done. We're not going to go over that. Be mindful they're very slight. Essentially, based on what we talked about before, you could still go with the MMPI-A and do an interpretation. The last one is the MMPI-RF, Restructured form. It is based on criticisms of the MMPI, essentially with people that made it said, hey, let's make something that's better, but then nobody's used it, nobody uses it, so it's like, well, why bother? It improves heterogeneity among scales. How? By using RC scales, which we already talked about. It's shorter, and it also includes a psy-5. So essentially, they made a new test, developed these new scales, and then they're like, wait, but we can also use these scales for the MMPI-2, which is used by more people. But it's shorter, so that's pretty neat.
Yeah, that's kind of it about the RF.
And that's about it. Are there any questions about this or anything else? I know that we just sort of bombarded you with sort of a semester's worth of information in like 3 hours, but
Still alive? Everyone?
well, thanks for coming.
And I mean, like, I just want to reiterate, and I mean, like, it seems really intimidating too, and you just sit here and you're barraged with all of this information. But if you just kind of sit down and pace yourself and like just focus, like Mauricio said, on going through and really understanding the clinical scales, like that's 10, well, not really, like 5 you don't really get. So that's like 9 scales of really understanding conceptually what they're pulling for. The rest you can mostly deduce by clinical common sense.
0 doesn't.
Well, 0 doesn't, yeah. So that's even less. So that's just really what I would focus on. Don't get overwhelmed by the amount of information that you have to learn, because essentially code types come a lot more fluidly and clearer when you really understand those 10 clinical scales.
Yeah. Like when I was studying, I decided that I was not going to memorize all the 2 and 3 point codes because my memory is not as great as I wish it were. So what I did is I just read over the description of all the 2 and 3 point codes from both this book and the Birth Nat book, and I identified and made a note, like, which of the 2 parent scales, so which one of the 2 clinical scales is contributing to that. And then I realized that if I read a description of it, I was able to make a really good guess of what 2-point code it was. So that's a good way to study. And had we had more time, something we would have done, but just sort of read a descriptor of, like, this is what the person presents with. Like, what are the possible 2-point codes? I urge that you do that to study, and it's sort of like just to think about it more critically, and you don't have to memorize everything, but you can if that's sort of how you learn best.
You will go a little crazy.
I'd really recommend memorizing like to really understand the validity configurations that I talked about earlier, the caret, the inverted caret, the ascending and descending slope. And really probably the 3-point code. I'm sure you'll all remember the 4-point one from my fantastic little cheer. But those ones particularly, like just the parts that I underlined in the slides and from your own reading, like ones that are really associated with poor treatment prognosis, ones that are associated with more extreme manifestations of psychological distress, because they're more significant and they might happen to be ones that it might be a question of which code type has the worst treatment prognosis, or do you know what I mean? Like they're triggering aspects of those code types. So I would take those into account if you don't memorize everything. Okay.
Thank you.